everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Adela Bassain, and I'm the program director here at Havara Shalom. We are so happy to see you this afternoon and so honored to present David Fuks as he reads his short stories and as you get to see the play that is coming also. So we are co-sponsoring with a couple of other organizations, including the Oregon Jewish Museum and Holocaust Education Center. So I'd like to present now Judy Margolis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm really just going to be a second. It's such a great pleasure. Where's David? Is he? There he is. So, you know, everything has a silver lining. And David, I'm sorry to put it in this way, but of course, for some of us, we recall that the event was originally scheduled 2 months ago, a month ago, whenever. David did contract COVID, and we decided to co-sponsor together with NextGen and Havara and OJMCHE. And I think it's just a wonderful opportunity for us to work with NextGen, who we love working with. We work with them all the time, and Havara, who we probably don't work with enough, but we're also really delighted. So David is also a member of our Speakers Bureau. I know other Speakers Bureau members are here today. If I could just see a show of hands so you understand that at the museum, we do run a Speakers Bureau. So if you're ever interested in having someone talk about their experiences during the Holocaust, the experiences of a family member or someone they knew, you're welcome to contact us at the museum and we can arrange a speaker. I have had the opportunity to read the play. It is really beautiful. It shows David's talent both as a very strong writer, as a very poignant writer, and of course some of us know David for his shtick and his stand-up comedy, and I think it all comes through. So thank you very much, and I'm calling on Sue to come up.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Richard and everybody. I'm going to be introducing David, but before I do, I just want to say a few thank yous to Adela Bassain from Havara Shalom for all their support that they have brought to this event. Adela, where are you? Way And of course, Judy Margolis from OJMCHE for the fabulous cookies and everything else that organization does for this community. And I also want to thank all the volunteers. If you could just raise your hand, you're wearing name tags. I know, or Havara members too, but if you have this kind of name tag, it means you helped out today and will help out today. So just wanted to thank all of you. So I'm Sue Wendell, and I am the co-coordinator of the Next Generations group. I'm also the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Back in 2009, Diana Lindemann wanted to get second generation children of Holocaust survivors together. And shortly after I joined, and we are now co-coordinators. And the group has grown. It's not only 2 Gs, but 3 Gs, survivors, child survivors, survivors of, or descendants of Jewish refugees. I mean, everybody who wanted to help with our mission, which is simply to keep stories alive and relevant for today's world, a very important vision and mission. And we do this through educational programs, events like this, and community service. We're a little group with a big mission, and we couldn't have done it without Havara Shalom and OJMCHE. So we really appreciate this type of collaboration. All right, now on to David. You may know David as the past CEO of Cedars-Sinai Park. And he's, as Judy mentioned, he's on the Speakers Bureau, and he's also a member of Next Generations group. And I'm sure you have worn many other hats in this community, but people probably know what they are. Okay, but he's also an author and a playwright, and that's what we get from him today. So using a creative approach, His stories and play are going to take us along together on his personal journey of understanding what growing up and being the child of Holocaust survivors is like. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to David.
Good afternoon. I'm very thrilled and excited to see you here as part of this event. This has been a remarkable experience already, just in terms of the level of community response and, to what it is that we're doing. Before I read the stories, I'm going to read you 4 stories, and then we'll take an intermission. Before I read the stories, I want to talk a little bit about where this all comes from. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in his book Letters to a Young Poet, talked about how he approached creative writing. And basically what he said is that I'm grossly paraphrasing, I'm not expressing his elegance as a writer, but what he said is, you take your experience in and you sift it through your own humanity. And then when you sit down to write, you have that material to be able to use to make something creative happen. And that's really what gave birth to my capacities as a writer and the writing of plays as well. And I want to make a distinction between what is a true story in terms of an actual set of circumstances and what is fiction. What you're going to hear are stories that are fiction, but they are based on true experience, the life experience that I had as a child of Holocaust survivors. But before I do that, I want to share with you a couple of stories that are true stories about my parents, because I want you to have a little bit of a feel for who they were. I didn't have an easy relationship with my parents when I was a kid, and I didn't understand why at the time. But my dad had a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is understandable for a man who was in Buchenwald for 5 years. And my mother was obsessive compulsive. And I didn't understand what that was about. But what it was about was that my father was among those individuals who became hard as a result of that war experience. When he was a little boy, his mother called him Süßkind, sweet child. And as I grew up, I didn't know Süßkind. I knew Schwerkind, hard child or difficult child, because that's the guy that raised me, was Schwerkind, until the end of his life, when I discovered and was able to meet Süßkind. But that was part of his life. His father was a Hasidic rabbi. I carry my grandfather's name, and I try to honor it. One of the things I know about Hasidism is the value of, it's more important to know how you feel than to have book knowledge. And of course, there's that expectation that you still study and do all of that, but how you feel is really of great importance. My mother came from a small town called Benjin, and she was a very middle-class kid. Did well in school, opened a daycare center, did some really interesting things until she was 16 and was taken away and was enslaved. And I think I was about somewhere in my 50s when I started to realize what it was that caused her to be obsessive about the house being in order. And it was because outside of the house, the world was chaos. The world was dangerous. So she decided in the house, everything was going to be in order. And that was just how things were going to be. So I wanted to talk about that because coming to understand them as people and to revere them was really very important. I have to say thank you also for coming to my bar mitzvah. I've had several people mention that, and I think that's really fun. But as a writer, this is a coming of age moment for me, which I'm really excited about. And I want you to know that although you're going to hear stories that express some criticisms and some disappointments, you need to understand that as a kid, I sort of lived in a Chekhov play. And in the context of a Chekhov play, there's a lot of disappointment that happens and a lot of hidden humor. So I hope that you'll enjoy that. My dad was an atheist. He was among those Jews who couldn't fathom how God and Auschwitz could be part of the same universe. Regardless, he was a Jew. Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, talks about the fact that Judaism is a civilization that has a religion attached to it. And that part of what we have to do as Jews is to express folkways, to have cultural events and cultural expression to create a Jewish atmosphere. And that was a significant aspect of what was going on, and part of what was sort of lost by the murder of so many people in Eastern Europe was that attempt to kill the Jews. And my writing, to some degree, is an attempt to rekindle some of that flame. The first half of the show is dedicated primarily to my father. The second half of the show dedicated primarily to my mother, and also to my younger sister, Myra, who is of blessed memory now also. My younger sister was a way better person than I ever was. She is remarkable. Her son Joe is here, my favorite nephew, along with my son Ian. And so they're hearing stories about their grandparents once again, and they're having that experience. My dad was remarkably resilient. Came to the United States. He was greeted by the Hebrew International Aid Society. They said, "Welcome to the United States. You're going to Detroit." That's why I'm a Tigers fan. And my dad got a job sponsored through the Jewish Federation of Greater Detroit at a Ford Motor Company factory, and they made him a general sweeper. And his reaction is, "What a wonderful country. I don't even speak English. I'm already a general." So he really was quite resilient. My parents sent me to a yeshiva when I was a little kid, and which is an interesting thing for an atheist to have done. My dad subscribed to atheist magazines. I looked at them once, and I couldn't figure out why he needed more than one. Because they all said the same thing: 10 more reasons not to believe in God. And actually, I told him once that part of the reason I believed in God was his atheism. And he said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I can't believe you're angry at nothing." And he told me to shut up. But I asked him when I was a young adult why it was he decided to send me to a yeshiva. Because, he really rebelled against that stuff. And he said, "One of the things I learned in the context of marriage is you make compromises. And your mother wanted you to go to a yeshiva. So I compromised." So this first story is called Yeshiva Boy. It begins with a sentence in Yiddish. "Hast du gut gedavent?" my mother asked. "Did you pray well?" Having gone to services with her for the first time in many years, sitting together this time rather than being divided by an Orthodox partition, she noticed me shifting in my seat and afterward asked me about the quality of my prayer. "Yes, Mama," I replied. "Ich hab ganz gut gedavent." I prayed well. When I was a second grader, my double life began. During the day, I attended public school with the American kids. Afternoons and Sunday mornings, I continued to attend the yeshiva to receive instructions from the rabbis. We arrived by bus at 4 p.m. and entered the sanctuary for the afternoon services prior to going to class. Many of the songs were very familiar to me, but there was one prayer that was particularly long and arduous, the Amidah. My Hebrew was not great. I struggled to read each word and comprehended the meaning of only a very few. Long after the others had finished and were singing the final melodies, and even the final mourner's Kaddish was recited, and the others were leaving to go to class, I would stand struggling with each word, trying to bow correctly with each of the 18 blessings, trying to pray correctly. Finally, one of the older boys took me aside. Look, kid, he seemed a lot more like an American kid than a yeshiva boy. And nobody's expecting you to read every word. Nobody's paying that much attention. Just hum and rock like the rabbis do. Bow when they bow. Say amen when they say amen. Sing the songs you know. Turn the pages. And when everyone else is done, you're done too. Just go to class. Really? I was stunned. God won't mind? Nah, you're not bar mitzvah yet. It's no problem. From then on, I would turn the pages and hum and rock and bow just like the rabbis did. It was great. I could look around and see what the other kids were doing. I could relax and daydream to pass the time. I could go to class. Then I got caught. Rabbi Bernstein was his name. He was not my regular teacher. He taught the older boys' bar mitzvah class. He was a tired man, older than his years, an intellectual stuck among school children. He would have preferred a quieter life. He lost no opportunity to express his disdain and disappointment. As I stood rocking and humming and bowing during the Amida one afternoon, Rabbi Bernstein appeared behind me. "You're not praying," he said. I froze for a split second. Perhaps he was talking to somebody else, I thought. I hummed and rocked and bowed. "You're not praying." His voice boomed. I hummed and rocked and bowed. He stood directly behind me. "I know you're not praying," he said in a very menacing tone. How did he know? He was a rabbi. Did God contact him to complain of my impiety? I was terrified. I hummed and rocked and bowed. He stood directly behind me. It occurred to me that there was no way he could be sure I was not praying if I just kept up my charade. If I were praying and he hit me and made me stop, wouldn't it be a sin? He stood behind me. I hummed and rocked and bowed. I hummed and rocked and bowed. His silent presence was like a stone pulling my soul to perdition. I hummed and rocked and bowed. At last I did pray, sincerely, with a sincere heart. "Please, God," I prayed, "please make Rabbi Bernstein go away. I'm just a kid. I can't read Hebrew good. Please make him go away." I hummed and bowed with deep sincerity. It worked. Rabbi Bernstein walked away. I hummed and rocked and bowed. I smiled to myself. I sang the closing songs with passion and pleasure. I had prayed and it had worked. God was listening. When the service ended, I ran laughing with the other 7-year-olds to my classroom. You know, in the context of the Jewish liturgy, they talk about two forms of prayer. Keva, which is the structured part of prayer, and kavanah, which is the spiritual moment that you're having. You can't have those all the time. But that was my first experience with kavanah. I was very sincere about it. So this next story is kind of a sequel to the first one. I wrote it much more recently. And it's a little bit more dour. In order to note the passage of time, I will recite numbers for the different sections so you have a sense as to how time has passed. I know sometimes I've got it coming. I'm not an angel. Besides, sometimes I say things without thinking first. My mom says, "He's a little impulsive." My father says, "The kid talks too much." My sister Florence says to me, "Somebody must have dropped you on your head when you were little." which if it's true, I suspect it was my sister Florence who dropped me. Florence was never crazy about me. She's 7 years older and was not happy when I came along. When can we take him back? Florence asked. He's your brother, we're keeping him, Mom told her. Can't we get a puppy instead? Florence wondered. Hell, she doesn't even like dogs or any other kind of animals. Oh, once I brought home a kitten and she jumped up on a chair and screamed. Maybe somebody dropped her on her head when she was little. You were an accident, Florence said to me. You were a mistake. 2. I learned not to trust Florence pretty early. We were at a lake. I was 3, I guess. So Florence would have been 10. She was making a mud pie. And when she was done, she took a big spoonful and shoved it into my mouth. I started crying and Mom started yelling at me for eating dirt. I told him not to, Florence said. So we don't get along so well. I got back at her last year. I was 9. Florence was going on a date. You look awful pretty, her date said when he came to pick her up. I think she looks pretty awful, I said. Florence ran to find Mom and complain about my big mouth. That's when I pulled out the pictures I had in my pocket. Here, I said, handing them to her date. I just wanted to give you an idea of what a treat Florence can be. They were naked baby pictures of her from when she was about 1. The guy laughed and blushed. I thought it was great until Florence and Mom came into the room and saw what I was doing. Florence screamed and tried to smack me. Mom sent me to my room. Wait until your father gets home, she said. I figured Dad would just laugh. He did laugh. He also smacked me with his belt. Anyway, I think it was worth it. 3. Don't get me wrong, though. Getting smacked by Dad is not to be taken lightly. He's a very tough guy, and he will sometimes smack me just for walking into the room and making too much noise. When we were on vacation last summer, we stayed at a motel in a lake. That's mostly what people do around here. We go to lakes and get bit by mosquitoes. Anyway, there was a restaurant next door, a real greasy spoon, Florence called it. It looked okay to me. I went inside and I saw the menu on the wall behind the lunch counter. I thought I was in heaven. Hamburgers cost only 35 cents. Cokes were a dime. I guess I got excited. So I ran into the motel room and hollered, hamburgers are only 35 cents. Dad hit me so hard I went flying into the wall. He looked at me and shook his head and walked outside. Now look what you did, Florence said. My nose was bleeding. I was crying. Go outside, Florence, but leave your father alone, Mom said. Then she got a wet washcloth to wipe my face and hold against my nose. He didn't mean it, she said. What did I do? I held the washcloth against my nose. It's because of the war, because of the concentration camp. He didn't mean it, she said. 4. Dad is an atheist. He doesn't believe in God, but Mom is religious. That's why I have to go to Hebrew school at the yeshiva. First, I go to public school, and after that, I get on the bus and go to Hebrew school. I go from 4 to 6 p.m. every weekday except Friday, and then from 10 a.m. until noon on Sunday. I think Mom wants me to go so I can stay out of trouble and get ready for my bar mitzvah. I hate it. The rabbis at the yeshiva hate us afternoon school kids. You're too American, they say, which is strange because in public school, I don't feel American enough. I'm the weird kid who doesn't play any sports. So during public school, I mostly try to avoid getting beat up because I'm different. And at the yeshiva, I goof around or hide in the chapel to avoid going to class. For a while, I tried to take Hebrew work seriously. I made an effort and got pretty good grades, but Rabbi Brown, my teacher, said, "You'll probably never do this well again." So I stopped caring and just joked around. Rabbi Brown looked at me with disappointment. I'm not mean or evil, I said. No, just profane and blasphemous, he replied. I didn't know what that meant. Being glib and ironic is not a sign of wisdom, he said. So now I have one more person who finds me disappointing. 5. So today is Sunday. It's my 10th birthday. So what did I get to do? I got to go to Hebrew school. I was not thrilled. I decided that I might as well be glib and ironic. I was in the parking lot when Dad arrived to pick me up. Happy birthday, kid, he said. Thanks, I guess, I replied. You guess, he asked. Well, it doesn't seem very important. Nothing big happened, you know, nobody was born, nobody died, I said in my ironic voice. So he slapped me, and I wept. Get into the car, you idiot, he said. Now something important happened. Now you have a birthday to remember. Kind of a sad ending. You know, do you remember, I think most of you are old enough to remember the crisis that happened in the early 1960s, when the Russians tried to put satellites into Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. When I was 12, that's what was going on. And I read, it was like the world was really tense, except for me, except my tension was that we were having a day where we were allowed to wear shorts to class, and I was just nervous about how my knees looked. And that story kind of reminds me of that. I just didn't get what was going on and why my dad would have been upset. This story is called Distinctions. It was published in 1918 and won an award. And I'm very pleased with it. And again, I want to remind you, the story is a piece of fiction. Okay, so you're going to hear the story. The characters in the story are not my relatives or people who I know. They're people who were created in the context of this story. Okay, distinctions. While some people eat with impeccable manners, others attack their food with an animal aggression. My father, Sam, was of the latter school, while his friend Simon was of the former. Sitting with the two men at Katz's Delicatessen in Detroit, I observed this stark difference with a studied indifference. I chose the venue for our meal together so that we might sit in the shelter of one of the high booths. By sitting next to my father, I was also obscuring his lack of grace and manners from the view of other patrons. Simon sat opposite us. His herringbone sport jacket and natty tie reflected the style of the college professor that he was. My father wore the clothes of a laborer, denim pants and a blue work shirt under a crew neck sweater, which now had splatters of sauerkraut and coleslaw that he wiped away with his napkin when he noticed my glance. I'd leave the food there in case I wanted a snack later, Sam said, laughing, but I don't want you should be embarrassed. My father laughed at my discomfort as he took another enormous bite of his Reuben sandwich. I was always afraid that he would choke when he ate like that. He seemed to be able to swallow the meat, bread, and sauerkraut like a python. Sam wiped his chin, and then took a long drink of beer, and then burped and winked at me. Simon acted as though he didn't notice. He took a delicate bite of his blintz and sipped his tea and wiped his mouth with his napkin before speaking to me. Marvin, you should join my son Irving and come to hear my lecture on Thursday at Wayne State. I'm speaking about the impact of the Holocaust in literature. I'll be discussing Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, Viktor Frankl. I expect you would find it interesting. You should go, college boy, my father said to me, while inadvertently spraying little projectiles of his sandwich as he spoke. From me, you can learn how to make a car, but from Simon, You can learn how to make distinctions. Both men laughed. I wiped a few flecks of the food from my shirt and smiled at these old friends. Simply sitting with them was an opportunity to make distinctions. Both men had endured the Buchenwald concentration camp. They had known each other as boys and had their differences, but in the context of their enslavement, they supported each other and managed somehow to survive. Sam had emerged with a shell of fierceness around him, and Simon with an erudite passivity as he rapped, and Simon with an erudite passivity that he wrapped with an intellectual mask. I'd be happy to attend, I said to Simon. How about you, Pop? I asked my father. Don't be so ridiculous. I don't watch Simon lecture, and he doesn't come to the factory to see me on the line. We just get together for lunch every few months to celebrate that we're still alive. Who knows? Maybe next summer we'll take you boys to a Tigers game, and we can pretend we're just regular Americans. My father looked at his friend. What do you say, Simon? We can bring our wives and have a few laughs. Simon looked uncomfortable for a moment. His smile had something false in it. We'll see, he said as he slid out of the booth and dropped some money on the table. The two men nodded, and Simon turned and walked past the deli counter and out the door without looking back. My father smiled at me and finished his beer. 2. I sat in the front seat of the car between Sam and my mother, Ruthie. Irving sat in the back seat between Simon and his mother, Sophie. We were driving downtown to see a Tigers game. Instead of looking out of the window and being a little excited about the outing, my mother was looking at some photos she had just picked up from the drugstore, and she was getting ready for her favorite pastime, expressing disappointment in me. It's a half a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread. Okay. What? Why are you making a face in this picture? She accused me. Then turning towards her best friend Sophie, she exclaimed, "My Marvin, he's always fooling around. I wish he could learn from your Irving how to present as a gentleman." I didn't even need to look around at the back seat to see what was happening next. Sophie put her arm around Irving's shoulder and pinched his cheek. "He's such a good boy and so handsome." My mother added, "My Marvin looks all right when he's not making faces." "Mom, I'm not making a face in that picture." I defended myself. "That is my face. You and Pop made that face. I'm sorry I can't be pretty like Irving." I heard Irving snort. "Don't hate me because I'm beautiful." I didn't hate him. I just didn't like him very much. The Tigers were playing in the old Briggs Stadium. Renaming it Tiger Stadium had not made it any more attractive, but I loved the place. It was gritty and a bit dirty, but it was real. This was the place that the right fielder Al Kaline played, that Rocky Colavito and Norman Cash were giants in, where Hammer and Hank Greenberg hit so many home runs and refused to play on Yom Kippur. That day, Mark Fidrich was pitching. They called him the Bird. I loved the guy, not because he was having a great year, but because he was nuts. He would get excited and groom the mound, and the crowd would go wild singing, "The Bird's the word." My father found a parking spot on the street a few blocks away from the stadium. A fellow was sitting in a lawn chair about 10 yards up the street. Pop walked up to him and handed him a $5 bill. "Watch my car, would you?" he asked. "I'll give you another $5 later if it's okay." Simon objected. "This is a public street. What are you paying this guy for? This is extortion." He seemed agitated. "It's a service," Sam responded. "This fellow is doing me a favor." The man in the lawn chair said to Simon, "I'd do a favor for you too, if you need it." "Well, you're a nicer person than I am," Simon said, and he stomped away. I suppose I am, the man in the chair said with a smile as Pop patted him on the shoulder and we all walked to the stadium. We sat in the bleachers. The game seemed very far away, but I didn't care. The Tigers were playing the Yankees, and everyone in the crowd was screaming their heads off, enjoying the rivalry. Irving took out a program and a pencil and started tracking the status of every play and delighting in the statistics. My father bought me a kielbasa. He bought my mother a kosher dog and bought himself 2 beers. Sophie had packed a lunch for her family, and Simon sat stiffly drinking tea from his thermos. This is a game of situations, Simon remarked. Who cares? Countered Sam. Ruthie and Sophie looked at each other and laughed. Simon looked at them suspiciously. They all knew something he didn't, as though they all knew something he didn't. Sam teased him. Take it easy. Let them have a good time. Don't worry. They're not talking about you. Simon turned to my father with inordinate anger. He spilled hot tea on himself, which made my father laugh. Simon screamed in pain or frustration. You bastard, he yelled, and he stomped away to find another seat and nurse his grudge. 3. Over the years, there weren't many encounters between our two families. Sam socialized with his friends at the Workmen's Circle Branch 227, a sort of Jewish socialist Bund Elks Club. He loved going to the meetings where he could drink vodka with his friends and sing. He also loved the energy among these Eastern European Jews who had moved a bit to the right and become Democrats and enjoyed yelling and taunting each other. Simon engaged more frequently in university politics at Wayne State. And when he did attend an event at the Workmen's Circle, he made it clear he was only doing so to indulge Sophie and her desire to spend time with Ruthie. The women had grown up together, and they loved each other. During these encounters, Simon looked at the Bundes crowd as a group of misguided peasants. Don't worry, my father teased him. I won't tell them that you voted for Eisenhower and then for Nixon. At a New Year's Eve party, Simon announced his family would be moving to Lawrence, Kansas. He'd been offered a philosophy professorship. Are there Jews in Kansas? My mother asked. Of course. It's a university town. There's always Jews at the universities, Simon reassured Ruthie. I suppose they also have furniture stores. Perhaps you can find Jews there that you can look down your nose at, my father joked. Simon's smile was more of a sneer. Don't worry, Ruthie. We can travel to visit each other and go on vacations together. Sophie put her hand on my mother's arm to reassure her. Simon looked at Sam as if to say, don't count on it. We did visit once. Irving had just graduated from MIT with a degree in engineering. I was invited along for this important celebration. My recent MFA in theater arts did not similarly impress the need to celebrate upon my parents. They were convinced I would likely starve to death. Marvin, maybe you can teach, my mother said. Learn to act normal, my father advised. My presence at the gathering was a duty I didn't relish. My father was glad to have my company so that he could have an audience for his anti-intellectual wisecracks. My mother, no doubt, took some pleasure in having an opportunity to share their disappointment in my achievements as she compared me to the handsome and brilliant Irving. To my surprise, Irving was actually glad to see me. He had entered college prior to his parents' move, and he had few friends in Kansas. Irving invited me into his father's den to see what he had been working on at MIT. He held a small box with a keyboard on his lap. It's a new kind of computer. We're teaching it to talk, he said with pride. I was impressed. Computers at this time were generally huge and not being used outside of the university or military settings. Teaching him to talk seemed amazing to me. Well, what can it say? I asked. Irving typed and pushed a return key and the machine said, burp. He repeated the process and the machine said, fart. We both laughed. For the first time, I actually liked this guy. Irving, I'm so glad you're making such good use of this technological advance I teach. Marvin, I just wanted to make sure I was using words that might be in your vocabulary. Would you like to try it? I typed and pushed the return key. Screw you, Irving, the machine said. 4. The proper thing to say to someone in mourning is, may you be comforted among the mourners of Zion, my mother advised. 5 years after our families parted, we were flying back to Kansas for Simon's funeral. He had died of esophageal cancer. I'm sorry for your loss, my father said. That's simpler. The main thing is not to say too much, but to be present and kind, my mother added. Ruthie sat next to Sophie during the funeral, and I sat next to Irving. My father stood in the back of the chapel. He was not fond of religious services, but attended for Ruthie's sake. Thanks for being here, Irving said to me. We need you for a minyan in the house later. Finding 10 Jewish men for an Orthodox minyan in Lawrence was apparently a bit of a challenge. At the gathering at Irving's parents' house, after the funeral, I stood next to my father in the back of the room. I fumbled my way through the liturgy and noticed that Sam was shifting back and forth next to me without a prayer book in his hand. I hate this crap, he whispered. My father and God were not on speaking terms. I get it, I said. After the service, we entered the parlor where Ruthie and Sophie were sitting together. They sat in chairs without cushions. The mirrors were covered with cloth. People were lining up to express sympathy to Sophie, and Ruthie sat quietly holding her friend's hand. There was a table with fruit and cold cuts and soft drinks. Irving stood nearby, talking with a few of his father's university friends. Sam paced uncomfortable and then walked over to me. Come on, boy, let's go to a bar, he said. It appeared I was to be the designated driver. I nursed a bottle of Rolling Rock beer while my father drank 2 double shots of Stolichnaya vodka. His face had a bit of a blush as he began to relax and talk. It's no surprise to me that Simon died of cancer. When you carry secrets and fears, they eat at you, Sam said. From Buchenwald, I asked. No, that hell was straightforward. The Nazis used us as slave laborers. They killed randomly and with pleasure. And if you had a skill like Simon's, they used you to keep their records. If you were a brute like me, you spent your days mucking out latrines and burying the dead. In that place, Simon and I watched out for each other. He could get a little extra bread, which he shared with me, and I could keep the bigger men from taking bread away from him before he could eat it. He always ate too slow. Simon was always trying to protect his dignity. I was simply trying not to be killed. No, the secrets came after the war. I was intrigued by Pop's openness. He rarely spoke about the war. What happened when you were liberated, I asked. Simon and I were separated toward the end, and I was forced to join a death march to Auschwitz. A few of us tried to run away. The others were killed, but I ran into the woods and kept running for 3 days and then collapsed. When I awoke, I was in a chair face to face with a Wehrmacht lieutenant. I lied to him and told him I was a prisoner of war. I was hoping he would send me to a stalag, not to a concentration camp to be killed. Shut up, Jew, the Nazi officer hissed. I thought right then that I was a dead man. Then he surprised me. We are losing this war, the lieutenant said. For me, the time for killing needs to end. He then sent me to a stalag, where I was placed among the Russian soldiers. This was lucky because the Polish soldiers would have killed me. And Simon, I asked? He was liberated from Buchenwald, and when he was stronger, he made his way back to Lodz. I ran into him there. We embraced like brothers, but it was difficult in Poland. We decided we couldn't stay. My father ordered another double shot and swallowed quickly. He shuddered a bit and smiled bitterly. You see, the Poles were not so excited to see any Jews coming home. You're alive? They asked, but not with pleasure. Perhaps they were afraid and that we wanted our homes and our old lives back. But I already knew that this was impossible. Impossible, I repeated. First, what did I have? My parents, my brothers and sisters, my wife and daughter had all been killed. My so-called friends in the labor movement had been the people who betrayed me. I went back to Lodz because I had no idea how to move forward. Second, the Poles were making pogroms against those of us who had returned. I felt that to stay was to die. I had been doing nothing but drinking for 2 weeks. And then I ran into Simon. Having a friend gave me some hope. So what about the secret, I asked him. What about the fearfulness, I asked. Be patient, boy, I'll get there. Pop laughed at my rapt attention. Simon told me he met 2 girls in Prague. One was for me, he said. You should come with me and meet the other one. So I agreed, and we went to Prague. The 2 girls were Sophie and Ruthie. I smiled at my father. It made sense to me. Mostly, it was the young and the most fit who had survived. Many were without roots or families. They were displaced persons left to wander about, and if they were lucky, to find each other and try to find a way to make a new start. My father leaned forward, sharing confidence with me. Loving Ruthie saved my life. She gave me the ability to start over. It surprised me to meet 2 innocent girls. They had been in Oberallstadt in a slave labor camp, and although they were pretty, they had been left alone by the guards. This had to be difficult. There were some who would do anything for a crust of bread, and some guards who would have thought nothing of raping pretty girls. But there was a randomness to survival. Maybe it was because they were friends, or maybe for some other reason beyond my understanding. But these 2 girls survived 5 years as slaves, and they were beautiful and wanted husbands and to make families. So Simon and I found a rabbi, and I asked him to help us marry these girls. The rabbi hesitated. He said, you're both married men. Who knows if one of your wives is alive? Put up a notice with the Allies Refugee Agency and wait 30 days. If no one responds, then I'll marry you. That sounds reasonable, I said. Those were not reasonable times, my father responded. Simon started to weep. I got angry. I said to the rabbi, listen, I'm not such a religious guy. I can sleep with whomever I want to. And if we're not married and she gets pregnant, let it be on your head. I was amazed by this. He was talking about my mother. I asked him, what did the rabbi say? My father laughed. He said, the rabbi asked what time the wedding should be. I remained mystified. We all got married and made families. How is that a problem for Simon? Sam continued. We went to Landsberg in Bavaria to a displaced persons camp. It was in the American sector of occupied Germany. We all wanted to come to the USA. We 2 couples were sharing a small apartment. One day I went with Simon to buy coffee beans. We walked into a shop, and suddenly Simon turned and ran out the door. I didn't understand why until I saw Rivka, Simon's wife. She had survived. Simon was married to 2 women. Oh, God, I said. If there is a God, he has a wicked sense of humor, my father said. So Rivka approached me. Where did Simon go? She asked. I don't know, I replied. He married again, didn't he? She asked me. I don't know, I lied. Well, I know, and you can tell him for me I don't care. I don't care if I ever see him again, she said, and she walked away. Simon was waiting for me outside the apartment building where we lived. He begged me not to tell Sophie or Ruthie. He wept and wailed until I agreed. And you never told anyone? Not even Mom? I asked. I'm only telling you now, because Simon is dead. I want you to know how a secret and a lie can kill a weak man's soul. You must never tell anyone, my father instructed. As long as we are alive, you must never say a word. But why not tell Ruthie, I asked. Sam's voice was sweeter and gentler than I had ever heard it. Your mother has an innocent soul. We must protect it. Is there anything else about you that I should know? I asked my father. He ordered another vodka. No, boy. You could never understand, he said. So, my dad had a furniture store. Oh, I got to tell you a real story about my dad. In the context of the furniture store, he and my mom were working in the store, and a woman came in with her 12-year-old daughter, and she said to her daughter, I want you to meet your father. And my mother said, Henry? And the woman said, no, it wasn't like that. It was when this little girl was a baby. Your dad was selling from door to door. And he came to my house, and I had no money. I had nothing. No bassinet, no place for the baby to sleep, no baby clothes, nothing. And I said, I can't afford to buy anything from you. Well, he went away, and he came back a couple of hours later with a crib and baby clothes and diapers and everything I needed to be able to be a mama. So he did what a dad does, and I will be his customer always. So that was my father. I was in a store with him when, in his store, when I asked him to be sure that I had no intention of working in the furniture business, that I had other hopes and desires in mind. And he said, no, boy. That was my name till I was 30. It wasn't just boy, it was no boy. I'm doing this so that you can contribute something to the community. That's why I'm so proud of the organizations that are the sponsors of this event today. It's a chance to do something for the community. And I hope when you're making decisions about charitable giving, you'll think about these organizations. I told you, at the end of my dad's life, he became Z-skinned again. He became very sweet. And on his deathbed, he allowed me to bless him, to put my hands on his head and recite the Shema. It was a remarkable moment. I wrote this last piece, Becoming Israel, as a eulogy that I read at his funeral. It's called Becoming Israel because it's a reference to a moment in the Torah where Jacob is heading back to meet his brother Esau after being separate for 20 years. And he gets up in the middle of the night and ends up wrestling a divine emanation and is somehow victorious and is renamed Israel, which means God wrestler. So this is called Becoming Israel. Oh, one last thing. I use the word he for my father, my imaginary father in here, and I also use the word he for God. I'll try and make it distinct. He was angry and shook his fist as he entered the long corridor. Suddenly he felt young again. The power had returned to his arms and legs. With each stride, his limbs gained strength. His breath, which had been laborious, was easy and confident. He touched the top of his head. Yes, hair. He laughed I know. He laughed aloud. He could hear it clearly. He could hear his steps. He could hear himself breathing. He heard wind and bird song. He felt the sun on his back. He was outside now, under a blue sky, dotted by clouds. He could smell the grass as he stepped through it. He passed a tree and pulled down an apple. He bit. They were his teeth. He bit hard and chewed. It was sweet, delightful. He moved forward. He started running. It felt like flight. Where was he going? It almost didn't matter. Old friends appeared nearby. It didn't matter. Later, he said, we will have time later. He saw them smiling and nodding. He ran on. Would he ever grow tired? Then at the end of the field, he saw him. The smile was gone now. The rage returned. He ran forward with his fists in the air. A war cry came from his heart to his lips. It echoed as they met. They struggled, wrestling and crying. They rolled together. They fought as tears rolled from their eyes. Why? He screamed. What was I to do? He replied. You promised. You let them die. Why? He cried. I promised, and my promise is real, he cried in return. Where were you? He asked. Beside you, suffering too. The fighting stopped. You were supposed to be all-powerful. You were supposed to be strong and just. You were the lie my father believed. You were a myth that they cried out as they shook and prayed, facing east, looking for you. Did you even look back? Did you even care? I am more like you than you would have me be. You cried as I did. You rose and started again. You spit on my face to give me tears, and I beheld your beauty. I am not perfect. There is no perfection yet, no absolute peace. I can't give you back what you have lost, but see what you have made. See how you could love despite the pain. You are my image. You have wrestled and won. You are my promise. He stopped then and wept. The man's soul wrapped itself around God and rocked him in his arms. His anger was replaced by the compassion and strength that had never left him. Let me comfort you then, he said. Let me comfort you. Thank you very much. Let's have a 10-minute intermission, and then there'll be time for the play for love. Thank you.